The bells rang as they always had, their sound washing over the narrow streets and ancient stones of the city. Yet for Thomas, they carried no weight as they once did. He had grown beneath those towers, their shadows stretching across his childhood, their hymns filling the days of his youth, and for many years he believed the walls of his faith were unshakable. He served, he prayed, he knelt upon the cold pews and lit the candles with careful hands, whispering words he was taught to whisper. But time, with its long and patient fingers, had drawn cracks across his certainty. It began not with anger, but with weariness, the long corridors of rituals that no longer reached his heart, the questions he carried that never found a resting place. He would sit among the faithful, hear the ancient verses spoken, watch the gold of the icons shimmer beneath the candlelight, and still feel the same hollow wind within him, a space where meaning should have been. The city was proud of its cathedrals, its processions, its deep roots. Yet in the alleys behind the towers, hunger lingered, pride festered, and the hands that raised offerings sometimes closed too tightly upon coin. Thomas walked those alleys often, not to mock, but to understand. And each time he returned with the same ache, that the God he longed for could not be found in statues alone, nor in rituals polished until their soul had thinned. One evening, as winter's edge swept over the city and the bells called the faithful once more, he wandered beyond the familiar quarters into streets where the stone changed color and the air held the scent of distant lands. There he found a doorway open, its threshold low, its light warm. Inside, men were washing their hands and faces with a calmness that felt like the pause before dawn. No icons adorned the walls, no statues loomed, only soft rugs and shelves of worn books. Thomas paused, his fingers still cold from the wind, and a man with gentle eyes greeted him with a nod. No more, no less. He did not know the language they spoke as they prayed, yet the sound wrapped around him not as command, but as a tide upon the shore. He left before they finished, unsettled by the peace that lingered upon his coat like the scent of their tea. Days passed, and curiosity drew him again, then again. Each time he came, he expected to be questioned, pressed, drawn into some argument, yet no one demanded his name, no one asked him to choose. They spoke, instead of mercy that flowed wider than rivers, of a creator who needed no image to be near. Thomas listened, his heart a cautious bird, and began to feel the walls of his doubt soften. He still lit candles in the cathedral, still stood in the procession when his family called. Yet when the night deepened, he found himself whispering to the quiet sky, asking questions he had long buried beneath stone. Could truth be simpler than the layers he had wrapped it in? Could the God he sought have always been beyond the golden doors? The snow thickened upon the city roofs, and the bells rang, but their echo no longer filled his chest. He dreamed, instead of open fields, of water flowing clear, of a prayer that asked only for his heart to turn, not his pride to boast. The winter grew deeper, and with it the silence within Thomas began to stretch wide like the frozen river that cut through the heart of the city. By day, he performed his duties as before, carrying books through the halls of the cathedral, guiding visitors with polite answers, lighting candles that melted into the same pools of wax he had seen since boyhood. But each flame now cast two shadows, one of the faith he had been given, and one of the path he had begun to glimpse. At night, when the streets emptied and the snow fell in soft, unending sheets, He found his steps leading not to the high gates of the church, but to the low, unmarked door, where the light glowed gently, and voices murmured verses in a tongue older than the stones. He told himself at first that it was curiosity, a passing interest in the ways of strangers. Yet when the elder with the calm gaze poured him tea and asked nothing more than how his day had been, Thomas felt a quietness he did not know how to name. They spoke sometimes, not of conquest or creed, but of the weight a soul carries when it forgets its source. The elder told him that the heart was like a mirror, and that years of pride, of noise, of rituals without meaning could cloud it until the stars themselves seemed to vanish. Polish it with remembrance, he said, and it will show you what was always there. Thomas lay awake that night, staring at the low ceiling of his chamber, the echo of bells replaced by that single sentence. He thought of the statues he had polished with his own hands, of the gilded chalices he had guarded, of the long rows of pews filled with people who sang, yet rarely smiled when they left. Could it be that faith was not in the weight of gold, but in the clarity of the heart? Days became weeks. He found himself leaving small habits behind, the endless debates with the other attendants about theology, the pride he felt when reciting the rites by memory, the sharpness with which he once dismissed the cries of the poor outside the gate. Instead, he listened, even when no one asked. He gave bread where once he turned his eyes away. And each time he returned to the little room with its worn carpets and warm lamps, he felt the same stillness wrap around him like the hush of snow. The men there spoke of prayer, not as a performance, but as a breath, a turning of the face toward the one who had no image yet held the world together. They spoke of mercy as something alive, something that waited even for those who had walked far in another direction. Thomas began to wonder if the God he thought he served had been close all along, waiting beyond the walls built by hands. His dreams grew vivid. Fields of green where bells did not ring but birds called, waters where no statues stood. Yet the air was full of praise, doors that opened without lock or demand. He did not yet step fully through, but the path was clearing, the fog thinning, and the ache in his chest no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a seed pushing toward the light. Spring approached slowly, dripping from the edges of the cathedral roof, as if reluctant to wash away the cold that had ruled for so long. Thomas moved among the familiar corridors with quieter steps now, his gaze often caught by the horizon beyond the bell towers, his thoughts wandering further than the sermons he recited. It was during one such sermon that a fellow attendant, young and sharp-tongued, noticed his stillness, and later questioned him in the sacristy. "You do not answer with the same zeal anymore," the boy said, his voice half curious, half accusing. Thomas smiled faintly and offered no defense, but the question lingered like smoke in the rafters. A week later, a priest he had long served under asked to see him privately. The room was warm, heavy with the scent of incense. The windows shuttered against the soft rain. "You have been wandering, Thomas," the priest said, not with anger yet, but with a trace of unease. "People speak. They say you go to the foreign quarter, that you listen to their words. Tell me it is not so." Thomas did not lie. He spoke of the tea shared, the verses heard, the peace found in a place without statues or bells. The priest's face tightened, not in fury but in fear. "Do you not understand what roads those lead to?" he asked. "Have you grown weary of the truth we guard?" Thomas lowered his eyes and felt the old habits of obedience tug at him. Yet another voice stirred deeper still, the voice that had begun to ask whether truth needed gates at all. As the weeks unfolded, whispers followed him through the halls. Some called him curious, others traitor. The bells rang louder, the sermons thickened with warnings of false prophets and wandering souls. He felt the weight of many eyes when he passed, the turning of shoulders where once there had been easy camaraderie. Yet at night, in the small room with its simple lamps, no one questioned him. They welcomed him with the same stillness, the same open hands. He washed his face beside them, not yet in the full manner they did, but in a gesture that felt like shedding the dust of long corridors. One evening the elder spoke softly as the rain whispered upon the roof. The path of return is not always lined with flowers. Sometimes it begins with stones. Thomas understood. The conflict was not yet open war, but the ground beneath his life had begun to shift. Invitations from his peers grew sharp, laced with suspicion. One even followed him to the edge of the foreign street, hissing words about betrayal and eternal damnation. Thomas listened without anger. He knew they feared what they did not understand, as he once had. But each shout, each warning, each bell that tolled against his steps only deepened the quiet resolve that had taken root in him. That truth could not be chained by rumor, nor silenced by walls. Summer arrived, warm and slow, filling the city streets with the hum of markets and the scent of bread rising in the open windows. The bells still rang each morning and evening, their echo threading through the alleys. But for Thomas, they no longer carried the same command. He moved through the familiar stones with a heart that felt both lighter and more certain, even as the whispers thickened around him. Some called him lost, some warned him still, yet the fear that had once tightened his chest had begun to dissolve. In the quiet hours before dawn, he would walk to the low doorway, where the lamps burned softly and the men prepared for prayer. There he learned to wash fully, the water cool upon his skin, tracing the places where burden had long rested. His hands that had clutched pride, his face that had worn masks, his feet that had walked in circles. He learned to bow, to let his forehead touch the earth, to rise with breath that felt like the first after long drowning. The elder spoke to him of the testimony, the simple witness that opened the path, to bear with the tongue what the heart already whispered, that there is no deity but God, and that his messenger was sent to guide, not to chain. On a night when the city slept beneath the thick summer air, Thomas spoke those words aloud. There was no crowd, no proclamation, only a few brothers standing by, their eyes calm with the knowing of what such a moment carried. The words felt both weightless and immense, like a key turning in an ancient door. He did not shed his past as one casts off a cloak. He carried it as a lesson, the long wandering that had led him here. In the weeks that followed, the conflict in the cathedral quieted. Some turned their backs, others watched him with cold curiosity, but the storm they hoped would break him passed like a spent cloud. He no longer argued. He no longer sought to win them by force of reason. Instead, he tended to the small acts that once seemed beneath him, feeding those who knocked at the gate, walking the alleys with bread and water, sitting with the lonely where no bells rang. A few who once whispered against him began to ask questions of their own, not because he pressed them, but because his steps had grown steady, his voice softer. his eyes free of the strain they had long known. Years later, as autumn returned and the leaves rusted upon the stones, Thomas stood again at the edge of the city, watching the sun lower beyond the distant hills. He thought of the boy he had been, bowing in cold halls, clutching forms without warmth. He thought of the first time he heard that call in a tongue he did not know, the tea that warmed his hands, the door that opened without demand. Now, as the evening breeze carried the scent of earth and rain, he prayed quietly, not for grandeur or revenge, but for mercy upon those who still wandered as he once had, that they might find the same clear water when their thirst became too great to ignore. His soul no longer turned in circles. It rested, polished like a mirror, reflecting a light that had never left the world, only waited for his heart to see.